My name's Peter. I will introduce the other members as we go so that they can tell you a little bit about their life and their story and how they're going to tell us some details around that. So I'll begin with a little bit of background about me. It's only fair enough that if I'm going to ask other people to tell stories about themselves, I should tell a story about me. Part of what we think about very carefully when it comes to emotional life is how we experience emotional life. So I'm a psychologist and I do quite a lot of research around how people make sense of their life. And there's lots of different ways of doing that. But one of the ways that's most sort of crucial is language. I'll give you an exercise to sort of mentally test yourself, and that's the idea of try to think about something without using words. It's really hard. You know, yes, we do think in pictures. Yes, we can hear music. Try and describe that music or try to describe that picture to someone else without words. It's really difficult. So language is very much intrinsic to who we are as people. It controls, it makes up, it forms what we think and how we think. And the other interesting thing about language is that you can't do it by yourself. One of the sort of philosophical ideas that has underpinned the great philosophies of being and who we are as humans and psychology behind who we are is this idea of the mind-body problem. And René Descartes, the philosopher, tried to sort this out by doubting everything about himself. And he came to the idea that the only real way to understand that you are here and existing is that you can continue to doubt and doubt and doubt and doubt. And you talk yourself into a circle and you go, yes, I know I'm here because I doubt. The problem with René Descartes' idea is that he couldn't do that without language. So when we talk about mind-body, one of the ideas I'll come back to later is how we actually create our sense of identity in conversation with other people. We cannot have an identity, I argue, without having a conversation with other people, real people, as like us, and imagined people. There's always a constant dialogue going on. So I'll come back to that. So that's my little spiel, and I'll give you a little bit more about me in a second. But at first, I want to just pass it on so our guests can say a little bit about themselves, who they are, and why they want to share some of their perspectives about writing and health and wellbeing and growing as a person. So, over to you.
Thank you. Hello, my name's Karen. I'm single, fellas. I have no kids, fellas. And I'm retired, fellas. I'm a catch. I am an auntie. I was looking after my nephew recently, and he was behaving like an Energizer bunny on Red Bull. So I did what any good auntie does. I took him down to the DVD shop. I got him one of those kids' movies, you may have heard of it, Silence of the Lambs. Kept him silent for the rest of the day. I do jest. I use words, I use literature to express myself. I did that growing up. I used to write and read ad nauseum. That was my escape from the bullying and torment and stuff that happened behind the scenes. I entered the workforce and went from job to job, being bullied to the point that it broke me. Hence, I was retired before the age of 40, which is a lot of people's dreams. But when actually confronted with it because of a medical reason, it is something hard to work through. My doctor, I was in and out of hospital for quite some time like a yo-yo, and my doctor suggested that I try writing and art as a form of trying to express myself and work through the emotions that I was going through. And that came about. I mentioned my nephew because he was the inspiration to my book, Deacon the Dragon is Sad. It started out as a poem, and when I was working through it, I was led back to an incident with my young nephew asking me why I was in the hospital and not being able to explain it to him at the time. So I continued to work on the poem into a book, which I wrote, illustrated and self-published. And I can talk further about that more, but I think for now,
great.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks very much. And yeah.
Hello, everybody. Where do I start? I have been a writer for as long as I can remember. My mum bought me one of those little A-frame blackboards when I was a kid and taught me to write, so I could write my name and a few other things before I started school, and I just fell in love with the written word. She'd buy me little golden books and I'd trace all the letters and pretend I wrote them. So I figured I was always going to be an author. Yeah, I then went on and spent 30 years being an accountant. But aside from that, I was a creative accountant because I continued to write. I think that reading as a child was also my place of escape. I had I had a loving mother, but a fairly dysfunctional family life. And I got into Enid Blyton as a child, loved that fantasy world to escape to. And throughout my childhood, I think I found that place to escape to more and more often, so that as I grew, I became quite dissociated and detached from my life. And that went on for a long, long time. Unbeknownst to me, I frequently acted out from my inner child. This place I went to, and this inner child protective personality sometimes took over, and I would talk in a baby voice. I would write with an entirely different handwriting at sometimes. So it wasn't until I was nearly in my 40s that I published my first book, and I think that I've got 4 books now, and this one, Eclipsed, is the first one I wrote, but the second one I published. I think all of them, on reflection, were me working through that story. There's probably a little bit of autobiography in all of them. This one is about a character with a darker side, and the anger and revenge and how that can wreak havoc on the personality. So having done that, I changed careers. I was lucky enough to be made redundant from my job of 10 years, which gave me a year's salary in long service leave and redundancy pay. And I decided to change courses. So I went and did a PhD in creative writing. And that morphed from being just a project about, I write crime fiction, just a project of how to better represent trauma in crime fiction, to a process of writing to work through post-traumatic growth. And it's framed by narrative therapy, and I've just run a workshop this morning in that process. So the current book I have written is fictional, and I have researched how writing a fictional story that has a similar emotional background and working through that process can be just as cathartic as creative writing, as real life writing. So that's where I'm at now, and I'm currently running workshops in using that process.
Thanks. And Susie.
Good morning. I feel quite privileged sitting with these 2 lovely ladies because I'm not a writer as yet, but I'm a social worker, and for many years I worked in psychiatry in Toowoomba and in regional areas. So I've worked from very young to very old and in between. And I worked at Bailey Henderson Health Services up north with the hospital up there, and Townsville. Seen a lot of changes during that time. Worked during some really difficult times in psychiatry too. But I wanted to talk today about my practice because it is in relation to what you both have been talking about, and Peter, because I truly believe in stories and what people have to tell. And that is what is so important, perhaps, in therapy or in counselling, is that relationship. every person has a story to tell. That story is what we use to create our own personal identity. And to move forward, that's the process of telling the story. So you can share that narrative, and I think that process of working out who we are and where we belong in the world and where we're going, that's our little story that we've created. And if we can do that and perhaps put that in writing like both of you have, I think that's a wonderful way and a wonderful medium of moving forward. And certainly that's how I did my practice, that's how I work as a social worker, and probably how I work today. Perhaps later I'll talk to you, I'm doing a little bit of research into children's books and personal identity and their stories, and I'm happy to talk about that later.
Great, thanks. Well, let me get the conversation going by picking on a couple of things that came up. Now, two really important words came up: explain and escape. So I'll first come to you. Use the expression explain, and I know Susie's got some stuff around explaining stuff as well when it comes to children. But tell us what you mean by explain. You said you had to explain it to
My nephew, yeah. My nephew was about 8 at the time. One of the visits, he came into hospital to visit me, and he said, "Auntie Karen, why are you in hospital?" And it was the first time I'd been asked that. And from such a young person, I didn't know what I should say, how much detail I should go into, and that type of thing. I have been diagnosed with a major depressive disorder with suicidal ideologies. So it is quite serious, and it is, as with any mental illness and anyone with any sort of disability, it's something that I need to monitor and keep an eye on and take treatment when I need it, that type of thing. So when I'm asked to explain why I'm still on medication, why am I still going to hospital, why am I still seeing a psychiatrist 10 years after I was diagnosed, I refer to my condition being very similar to asthma. If you're an asthmatic, you take medication to keep yourself going. Sometimes you need to take more medication because it flares up. And sometimes when it's at its worst, you need to go into hospital and get the doctors to help you through those rough times. And that's what my condition is like for me. And yes, I do still go to hospital. They're planned visits now, whereas before they were critical visits. So I do manage my condition, and I've got a wonderful support with my mum, who lives very close to me, and we're able to talk openly about it, which has been wonderful. And it keeps me well, and I'm proud of that.
Great. I'll come back to you in a second when it comes to the story that you wrote as the explanation. But Leanne, you mentioned the word escape. Now I've got another E. I had to think about what the other... I'd like alliteration. So we've got explain, escape, and Susie talked about elaboration. So I've got an E. So I'll come back to that. So, Leanne, escape. How did you come up with the idea that escape would be something through story and by story?
Well, escape was probably something I'd done as a defensive mechanism my whole life, and through various forms of treatment I was given more ways to escape, to go to a happy place, but I started to realise that escaping wasn't working through the issues. It was just pushing them aside. And as I said, sometimes I felt quite detached from my life. I would go out with my friends and everyone would be having fun and laughing, and I felt like I was outside of my body watching on. I was quite detached and I was unable to feel any emotion from that experience. And so fiction can be an escape from a reading perspective, and part of my project is also about, readers and how escapism can be beneficial. But what I did through the writing process is to stop escaping, to actually face it front on, to write about experiences and work through them to bring up some of those memories. And it was very surprising to me, some of the memories that did come up, and then I was able to work through and process them without just pushing them aside. The reason that I chose to work in fiction, and the reason that some other people work in fiction as well, is that it creates a distance for people. I've worked with some people who just couldn't get their real story out. They couldn't talk about their real story. And I found even while fictionally writing, I had blocks where I would go for 3 months without being able to write anything. But being able to take that step into another character's shoes and create distance and externalise your problems, I found was a much easier way to write about them and work through the process. And, there were times where this switch flicked in my mind and there were cognitive changes that I saw things in a different way. Because we all tell stories about our lives and what happened, and we believe they're true, but they're not always true. So I was able to see my story in a different way.
Can I go straight in? Is that all right? I think you've hit a really interesting thing, because you said when you were writing this story, that's when this process started. And I think that is elaboration. I think I've noticed, I've been doing some work on Emma Mactaggart's book. So she does a child rights program. So each child writes a story and they write and illustrate, and then the story is published. It's really fascinating because the stories are really pure. So they're just writing this lovely story about anything really. And in the process of writing this story, what we've been able to look at is that they do elaborate on these issues and these problems, which is really interesting because they're not thinking about that process. They're just thinking, this is what I want to write about. And it could be, I want to fly a plane. So they're writing a beautiful story about how to fly planes or get to flying planes. In the process, what they do is they're actually identifying those issues or a problem, which is really interesting because I think we do that in that storytelling process subconsciously, sometimes without even thinking about it. The other interesting thing is that when you do write about it and you start to elaborate, is that you're actually problem solving without thinking about it, which is really clever. So these children in the stories are writing pure stories, identifying problems. Lo and behold, they're actually solving it themselves. And I think that's the art of using writing to really find your personal yourself and using that narrative therapy, because it is about moving forward and it's a very clever process.
The notion of elaboration is important in my view in terms of time perspective. Because what we know about optimists, and there are some very strong optimists in the world, what we know about optimists compared to people who aren't so optimistic, I don't want to call them pessimists because it's not like an opposite. What we know about optimists is that they can elaborate, they can imagine, they can create images of stories about multiple potential futures. Right? Now, optimism is one of those things that drags people through. People talk about resilience. We talk about all sorts of things, stress management. But optimism is this belief that you'll be able to cope with whatever comes your way in the future. So there's that sort of sense of I can dig myself out of something, or I can create something new for myself in the future. So there's this real sense of futureness in storying that we have to think about. It's not necessarily just a story about the right here, right now. When Dan McAdams, who's a psychologist who's focused on how people create stories about their lives, thinks this through himself, he talks about the notion of life themes and generative life themes. Now, generativity could be people who are older, they want to pass on the stories to the young ones. But by doing that, they're actually creating a future. What's interesting about Susie's stuff that she's talking about is it's generative, and these kids are 6 years old, 7 years old, 8 years old. So they're already doing what we think old people do. They're being generative. They're creating the next chapter of life. Now, in behind all of this, there's symbols. People can often talk in abstract terms about something representing something else. Now, in your case, the explain process required something special. Tell us about that.
Yes, it was, I went to the fantasy world, so I went to dragons, and it was to help explain to children about sadness, about bullying, about isolation. And Deacon takes this journey. He He tries to speak to his friend, but he doesn't know what to say, and his friend doesn't know how to help him, so his friend leaves him, and he's left feeling even more alone, and he runs away, and he gets bullied, and so he runs further. And it's not until his parents find out, and they go and get an elder to help, and they bring Deacon back home, and through working with the elder, he's able to return to happier times. And I use this book not just for children, it's also for adults. Like I said, I made it so that I could explain my condition to my nephew. And when we went through the book, he went, "Oh, I understand that, Auntie Karen. That makes sense."
And that's it, isn't it? It makes sense. And how people make sense is the fascinating process.
That's right.
Storying and story, one's a process, the other's the product, the content. The storying process, the story product. They both do the same job of explaining. Now, if I can just throw a little bit of my own personal history in here. I do a lot of writing. As an academic, I write all sorts of things, very scientific, often very dry, very boring stuff. And they're all explanations, and they're all elaborations and so forth. But one of the peculiar exercises I've done in recent years is a particular research method called autoethnography. Now, autoethnography is the study of the researcher researching himself or herself in his or her context. So, you know, being a fairly scientific type, this all sounded rather subjective to me, and but I decided to have a go at it. So what I wrote about a few years ago was really about why I picked on a particular theory for my research that I was doing, which was about explaining how people create stories through this thing called My Career Chapter, which is something I invented to help people create a story. Because not everyone can just sit down like these good people and go and write stuff out. Some people need a lot of guidance, so that's what that was for. So where did that actually come from was my question. I just didn't pull it out of my head one day. There was something clearly from the past that enabled me to write this. I still don't know what it is, but I'm getting to my point. I have unfortunately, well, fortunately I've survived, but I've unfortunately suffered a pretty severe repetitive version of testicular cancer. And one way that has helped me, and I think people around me, including my colleagues, to make sense of that experience is by writing. So I thought, right, I need to write this thing out of myself. So I took to this autoethnography as a formal way of getting my story out. And that is still a work in progress. But the interesting thing around that is not just me writing about me. Other colleagues are now analysing that story from different points of view. So, which brings me to my next question is, what's it like getting other people to contribute to your story or edit your story? Sometimes editors can be brutal. They can be interfering. They can also be very supportive. So, Leanne, you've self-published and other published, someone else has done your work. What's it like having someone else putting their view into your stories?
It's very interesting because the most recent book I wrote was for a PhD, and my supervisors wanted it written in one way and the commercial publishing world wanted it written in a different way. I chose to use crime fiction because that's what I write in, and I saw crime fiction as a vehicle for writing about trauma, because a lot of crime ends up with traumatic experience. And there was a bit of sort of questioning about that, well, crime fiction can traumatise people, it can be sort of immoral, but it's formulaic genre fiction, and genre fiction has a set formula, which goes back to the point of, what do publishers and editors want and what do supervisors want. So my key strategy in writing that book was to look at the subgenre of trauma fiction, which deals with trauma and writes it in a beneficial way, and put those strategies into crime fiction. So that's basically what my project was about, and create this post-traumatic growth journey in the crime fiction. So being very academic, the book had to follow that process. Then I sent it to some publishers, and they gave me some very good feedback. They said, no, this got to go, this got to go, this got to go. Having been in the industry for quite a while, I've got quite a thick skin, and I took that all on board, and I was very happy to make those changes. But it then became a bit of a different book. So for me personally, I was happy to do that because it didn't change the story and it didn't change what I was attempting to do. And what I was attempting to do was to get that story out to the masses. The reason I chose to work in genre crime fiction is because 1 in 5 people, as you probably know, suffer from mental illness. But 1 in 3 of those, that one, don't seek any sort of help or treatment. And I saw this as a way of getting a story out to people that they could work through, that they could reimagine their own futures through the characters, to people who just like to read crime fiction, and that would be, you know, something that would happen for them as an aside. So, like I said, I was quite happy to make changes that would make that book more popular, and it was just recently longlisted for a publisher's prize, so I achieved that aim.
Well done.
Thanks.
Susie, you're currently reading your way through literally several hundred children's books.
This is what they look like.
There's an example.
Here's an example.
So in this sense, Susie's not necessarily the author, but she's almost acting like an editor, analysing from afar. What does this look like? What's it read like? What are these things? What's it like being an editor, staring over the top of some other person's creative story that's come from who they are?
Well, the biggest thing is that these are children. So you're coming from an adult, and I do have kids, but you've got to remember they actually are kids. They're 10-year-olds, a lot of them. So the biggest thing is that you actually have to be quite respectful. So it's really interesting because when you start looking at the story, some are quite simple, some are quite complex. So you have to come in with that I have had to say, well, I'm a social worker, I'm coming from that background. And so I am looking at what is this child as the author, and often the self-author of their own story. What are they actually trying to tell me, and can I find it? So it is quite interesting. You've got to obviously not be too critical, and you're not looking at mistakes or grammar, but you are trying to find that little story in there and how they have created their own identity, and even if it seems ridiculous or really far way off track, actually that's how they've solved it, and they've done really well. For example, it might be about 2 aliens who want to travel to Mars, and they're trying to find a way of getting to Mars and hopping onto Earth, and how do they do that? So you're trying to think in with all this adult ideas. Oh, that's actually a plan. When that's a plan, that means they're trying to investigate things. So it's really quite clever. Sometimes it can take 2 hours and I'll go away and I think, oh, I missed it. And then I'll come back and I think, actually, this little child is actually trying to tell me something. Just on a side note, it is quite interesting because I've read about 300 books, not all of them, but most of them. It is quite fascinating that a lot of our kids are experiencing a lot of mental health issues, and they're out there telling you. So it is that sharing process. So I think, when you've got those statistics of the prevalence of mental health, these kids are writing about it. A lot of them are really lonely. A lot of them want to have a friend. A lot of them are experiencing bullying. A lot of them think they're just not good enough. I'm not tall enough. I don't know how to play a sport. But they are solving their problems. They are putting it out there. And I think the beauty of the books is that because they're being shared, so that story is being shared in that community, whether it be at the hospitals, on planes, which is where the books go. So these stories are like a tool that other children and parents can use to even open up that conversation and that dialogue about mental health issues in a very lovely, nice, caring, very similar to your book too about the dragons. So yeah, it's.
So if we could pick up on that, so your story was about something that was about you, and you're explaining it, as you said, for someone else.
Yeah.
And so what I mentioned before was the idea of this: the editor is always looking over your shoulder, always interfering. In your case, it's a bit different because you're writing about you for someone else.
That's right.
So in that sense, you're not only writing about you, you have to observe you writing.
Which
something
didn't
over there.
actually happen.
Right. Tell us.
Well, when I was writing it, I was writing a story for my nephew.
Mm-hmm.
And after sharing it, I shared it a lot with mental health staff and workers. And I started getting the question, is this your story? Is this what happened to you? And then I had to take a step back and go, you know what, it is my story. I had to own it. I didn't own it before that question was asked. And I did get feedback. I entered it into a literary competition and it got shortlisted as one of the top 5 finalists. I thought, that's great. I entered it into another one and I got feedback that said, the judges found the topic, bullying and depression, good, but the illustrations are too amateurish and the verse treatment of the story does not rhyme or scan well enough to work.
Don't you love editing?
So if you buy the book, I'll let you make that decision. But I didn't do it for recognition. I did it to get my story out and to hopefully help others. And for something like this, I got this from a little girl after reading the book, and it says, "Hello, my name is Dana, and I wanted to write this note to say that I loved your book, Deacon the Dragon is Sad. I found it quite inspirational, and I feel happy by reading the story. I like the story as a 10-year-old child. I have wanted to be an author illustrator for quite a while. You're one of my favourite authors."
Excellent.
So that takes away all the bad stuff.
Yes, it does. Okay, so we've got some people in the audience. No doubt some of you are readers, some of you are writers, or perhaps wanting to become writers. Let's go through some of the suggestions in your own experiences of reading, writing, editing, thinking through the process of storying to create stories. What would be some of the suggestions that you would offer up to people to get them on the path to writing it out? Karen?
Like Nike says, just do it. Yeah, I did the whole process myself. I wrote, I illustrated, I scanned, I learnt to use Photoshop and print. I found a publisher in South Korea. I learnt to communicate in some sort of graphic talk so that I got the right colours in the right setting, because originally I sent it in, is it YMC something, and they wanted it in RGB something, and that's why I had to reset all the colours. Mum and I got so excited because they sent a proof to me, and the proof came, and it was not quite what I was expecting. It came in pages. I didn't actually get a book. And this was the cover with that as the front and that as the back. And I'm looking at it and I'm devastated because I'm like, it's back to front. And it's because it wasn't the printer's fault, it was my fault. Because when I looked at it on the screen, I had the front cover here, the back cover there. When you fold it, I had no idea. So I was so fortunate that I got a proof sent to me, as much as devastated that it wasn't actually a book, but I was able to fix that. I had no idea what sort of condition what my book was actually going to come in. I outlaid the money myself and have been selling it myself through schools and libraries and the mental health organisations. And it's a hard journey. It's not something for me to make money on. It's something for me to try and help people with. So I just say, start writing things down. If you're an illustrator, start drawing. But get the ball rolling. I think once I started, like I said, it was only meant to be a poem. But I got into it, and it took me back to my nephew and went into a book. And it took me just under 2 years, but I launched it at Mental Health Week 2016 and have been, trying to get it out into the public society since then. But give it a go.
All right, give it a go. Leanne,
Yeah.
what would you say to our budding authors or our bruised authors who've had their materials read by
Well,
others?
firstly, everything she said. I mentor writers for the Queensland Writers' Centre as well. And often, they come to me with a fairly amateurish, rough sort of work that they want to get structured. So my first probably piece of advice would be to learn the rules. If you want to get your work published, you want to get it in front of somebody, make sure that you follow the rules of writing, and that will make them look at your work first. Once you have established yourself, then you can bend those rules, because they'll often say to me, but you told me to do this, but this author I just read didn't do that. Well, yeah, they might have 4 or 5 books under their belt already, and you can be a little bit experimental. As far as the process of, if you're writing about your own life experiences, bringing those experiences out, I like to work with sensory memory exercises. So to think about the sort of not only the vision and the sight of the memory, but to think about the sounds around you, to, smells. For instance, when I smell sunscreen, you store a lot of memories bodily, and when I smell sunscreen, I'm on the beach. I grew up on Moreton Bay, and my dad's friend had a house on Stradbroke Island. We spent all our school holidays there. So if I smell sunscreen, I suddenly feel warm. I feel the warmth of the sun on my skin. I feel the breeze and smell the salt air. So those sort of things can help you bring up memories that you want to write about that are buried quite deeply and that are stored bodily in you as well. So that's another process that I go through. And another structure that I use in writing the story is called the hero's journey. I don't know if you've heard of that. Joseph Conrad set out this hero's journey. So that follows, again, the post-traumatic growth trajectory, where it's kind of a quest story where the hero is on a quest and they overcome their issue and the story is resolved. So there's some of the things you could look at to build your story.
Now, Susie will forgive me later for this, but I have to let you know that Susie's preparing to write something. So she's way off. So it's just a small idea at this stage. And no doubt any budding author who's preparing has some anxious thoughts.
Oh, I haven't written anything for 20 years, so it is quite nerve-wracking. I think, as I've learned from reading the stories, it is just actually learning to be quite free when you write and not to overthink it, because I think our whole lives we do overthink things, and we all want to be a perfectionist and we all want it to be perfect, but it is to have that freedom. I think having read the children's books, they do give you that freedom to just think, actually I can do this. And I think the other thing that we've all had personal experiences in our lives is that we actually do know our topics really well. In fact, even for today, I had to sit at home thinking, I actually know this, I've lived and breathed this for 20 years, and this is something that I have done on a day-to-day basis, and you do know your knowledge. So it's just being free to say, I know about narrative and I know about story writing, and just putting that down. So I think one of the other things I think is not to be afraid of people criticising, or being afraid to, you're going to get bad. Peter is actually my supervisor, so but I think, what's he going to say today? It's actually going to be really bad. I'll give him a glass of wine or something.
Yeah.
But I think it is not to be, and take that criticism. It's how we, that's part of that journey, is that we learn from those things and we do move forward from it too. So.
All right, now it's your turn. So we've had a couple of key points here. We've had explaining, escaping, elaborating, and editorial. There's an E. There's a lot of process that goes on around writing, because you're writing from ourselves, perhaps for ourselves, for others, but there is a voice that comes in there from our own voice, but also the voices of other people. So given what you've heard, some great ideas here, what are your thoughts? Share with us, what are your thoughts? and we have a microphone that can roam around. So if you've got any questions, comments, observations, please get them up. Let's talk it out, because that's a storying process. Come on. Oh. One. Just one. There we go. Thank you.
Firstly, I'd just like to say thank you to all of you for sharing part of your story, because I imagine it takes a lot of courage to stand up or sit down, present in front of us all, and I'm sure those very personal stories. And I also like the way, Peter, that you've summarised it quite succinctly in the explain, escape, elaborate, and edit, basically. But with someone like myself that really wants to see my name on a book and all that sort of thing, how do you have that courage to go up to someone to, say, please, read this, or get that feedback that you need, and not take it too personally? I'm quite interested in it. And I guess my enthusiasm comes because my mum always wanted to be, a writer, and she's written lots of poetry. She started a book. And like you, Peter, she had her own journey with cancer. And going through things on the weekend, I found, some pieces of hers that were just beautiful. And one of the stories was, I hope I finish my story before I leave this earth. But I just wanted some feedback about that courage that you all have standing in front of us.
Great question. And it does take courage. Yeah. Thank you. Okay. Any thoughts? What are your reactions?
Well, courage can only come from within. Surround yourself with people that support you. They're the people that make a difference in your life. Not the naysayers, not the ones that say, oh, you're wasting your time. Don't listen to them. Be with supportive people and have the courage, find the courage. I know with myself that as a person, I have very little self-confidence, but of my abilities, I believe in them. So that's what I use, my belief in my abilities. So I hope that helps.
I think taking that criticism on board probably comes with practice as well, but probably start by giving it to people who are readers. Don't give it to your immediate family, because if they have negative things to say, that's not always a good thing. My husband always wants to add words into my stories. And ask them, set some parameters. Ask them to let you know how it read, rather than give a personal critical opinion about the story. Ask for what you want. Maybe look at joining some critique groups who provide, and there are some online ones as well where you can submit your work, because then there's a distance between you and the person. But always go back to it. I remember the first appraisal I got for my first book, which looking back was probably woeful. I read it and threw it across the room and didn't touch it for a week because it's human nature to see the negative first, isn't it? So when I went back to it a week later and reread it, there was some really positive stuff in there, but I hadn't even seen that because I was eclipsed by the negative stuff. And it wasn't even negative, it was constructive criticism that was really helpful to me. So yeah, using that in a sort of courage as well. Look for the positives in what people are telling you.
Actually, I can really hear you and understand. I'm hoping that I do. Because, I went and heard Emma Mactaggart speak at some afternoon tea, and I was surrounded by these creative souls, and I'm thinking, I'm actually just a mother. I haven't done anything for such a long time. And I had this idea, and it is this thing that sits in your head, and you think, I really, really want to do this. So the funniest thing was I took this huge risk, and I went and thought, I'm going to do law, because it's like the antithesis of everything that I am. And I had to write a paper, and I hadn't written one for a long time. And that was really helpful, and I realised I actually didn't want to do that. And it is that next step, isn't it, to say, this is actually what I want to do, because then you've got to own, and it's coming from the heart, and you've got to believe that you can, you know, I actually want to do this, I can do this. And it is just saying something, look, I have this idea, and get the ball rolling and say, look, do you think this is going to work? I mean, I'm only starting, so that's my, the journey, but it is at risk, and just thinking, well, you know what, it's like the stories in themselves that we've been reading. It's beautiful because they all have dreams, and I think that's partly that we want to encourage that, and that's what projects us to the future and helps us get there. You know, it mightn't work, but you're going to give it a good shot, you know, give it a go, and it is at risk. So, yeah.
If I could relate to one of the things you said, you want to see your name on a book, right?
I think it's just that bravery, not so much for necessarily for others.
Yeah. Yeah, for me, I mean, unlike colleagues here, I've only edited one book, right? But I've written over 100 journal articles and chapters in scientific books, and I still get excited. Every time it arrives, it's like, yeah, it's still exciting. It never wears off, I'm sure. Is that the case? Right? Yeah. So, you know, put as I want to see it. That's a really important thing to do. And in this electronic world, it's sort of a bit different. But there are still some journals that I write for that still have that beautiful old paper thing, and it comes in the mail and you can touch it and you can smell it. Yeah.
Do you know, even that first process of saying to someone, oh, this is, you know, this is what I'm going to do, and actually saying, oh, is this possible, and having someone say, yes, this is possible. Yes, you can actually go through it. When someone said to me, when Peter said to me, you can write a paper from this, I went, yes, yes, this is fabulous, you know, and I think it is that motivation that then gets you through to that next, that's just that little journey.
It's quite addictive. So, any other observations? Yes.
Thank you. Sharon is my name, and thanks for sharing your stories. Very inspiring. I call myself a storyteller because I love telling stories, and I love telling my story, as I believe that it kind of bridges, you know, it's like a bridge that connects people, and when I do tell stories, people start seeing me as just another human being, you know, that I experience emotions, I experience pain, not just the kind of fabulousity that I am, you know. But, you know, storytelling is something that is really, really important for me. And I've always wanted to take that into a book, and have actually struggled very much, because I often felt either my family is not ready to see something like that and read something like that that's printed, that's permanent. If it's me just saying it and sharing my story, maybe people can understand, but if they see it written, it's going to be very confronting. I guess my question is, how do you write the story? I know you use fiction, you said crime fiction, but if you wanted to write something that's real, the people around you, your families, the people who would be impacted by that story, how do you kind of find peace with that and still go ahead and do what you want to do? It's a little bit of a conflict for me.
It's a big one.
Leanne?
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what ethics committees are for. I guess if it's an issue for you, it might be good to be upfront with those people at first and say to them, you know, this is what I'm going to do, this is what I'm intending to do. Thank you. Do you feel that you would have the courage to do that?
Yeah, but I think once you start to write, they might say, yes, go ahead. I mean, they support me anyway, but they might say, go ahead. But if it comes back, comes to them and they read it, they might get a shock.
Yeah, and that
Because-
would be the next part of the
Yeah.
process, would be to then give it to them to read before it makes it out to the world. Now, I just listened to Trent Dalton talk at Brisbane Writers Festival about this, because he wrote he wrote a fictional book about his family, but it was quite raw and everyone knew that it was about his family. And he gave it to his mother to read because she featured quite largely in the book, and he was prepared to take anything out that she didn't agree to, but she loved it apparently. So if you have those concerns, I mean, if they're people you are distanced from and you don't have the concern, then you might go ahead anyway. But those people are part of the story, and I think that ethically they have a right to have a say. And if you're writing that story, you're writing the story for them as well. So you might just ask them, do you want to edit this story? So they feel part of it. So they become part of the story itself, but they're not taking their story out.
Could you make it a fiction, but still
You could.
hide it under...
Absolutely you could. And put that disclaimer on the front that any resemblance to real people is coincidental. That's on all of mine. I must say, though, that I don't kill people. I've never killed people, even though these characters in my books have. If that is a more comfortable way for you to do it. And like I said, that was a more comfortable way for me to do it, to write. And the story I've written is entirely a different story to my story. It's about a mother whose child is abducted, but she's been through some similar experiences and acts out in similar ways.
Karen?
Well, I write in fantasy, so it sort of gives a distance for me, makes it a bit easier.
Can I just give an example from myself? I remember my first, I call it tour of duty, my first tour of duty with cancer. I was lying in the hospital bed, and at that time my son Hamish, I think, would have been 8, he walked into the ward, and it still hurts now, and I looked at him, and I went, how am I going to explain this? And he's looking at me with fear, and it still hurts, so sorry. So thank you, and thank you, and thank you. It's been a great session, and sorry to end like that, but it's about us. It comes from the heart. So thanks very much.
Thank you.